The Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s and its eventual success, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, was one of the most important moments of African American history of the 20th century. No less important is all the work done by civil rights activists and leaders of the early 20th century, who tirelessly worked to set the foundation for later progress. E B Du Bois deserves to be inducted into the Hall of Fame for his visionary leadership, humanitarian work, and intellectual legacy, which applies to today's world as much as it did to yesterday's. Du Bois was born on February 23, 1868, in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He was raised in a relatively racially tolerant community with a lot of recent European immigrants. He attended integrated schools and showed great academic aptitude. He graduated from both Fisk University, a predominantly black university, and Harvard, becoming the first black man to earn a PhD from Harvard in 1895. During the 1890s, certain predominantly black neighborhoods in Philadelphia were experiencing record-high amounts of crime, poverty, and drug addiction. He was invited to Philadelphia by the University of Philadelphia to study the black community there. Many white residents of the city held that the black people living in the city were the causes of various social ills. Going against the wishes of the university, who wanted to prove that black people were causing harm to society, he realized that the biggest cause of crime was poverty. His work on this topic had major influences on progressives of the era, who tried to combat the exclusion of black people from higher-paying industrial jobs and tried to extend support to poorer black communities in the form of hospitals and schools. In Philadelphia, Du Bois realized that in order to have a truly egalitarian democracy in America, segregation could not continue. Du Bois strongly opposed the Atlanta Compromise, created by Booker T. Washington, another influential civil rights leader of the time. The compromise between rich Southerners and black people allowed Southern black people to receive education, equality within the legal system, and economic opportunity in exchange for them not challenging racism, segregation, and their inability to vote. Du Bois criticized it, saying that black people of the South should not accept anything short of full integration. Much of what was promised to black people in the Atlanta Compromise would be revoked or never granted. Both Du Bois and Washington were very influential figures representing the black community of the USA. Supporters of Washington were typically higher class, whereas Du Bois appealed more to poorer people. Among white people, Washington was favored because of his willingness to compromise, allowing them more influence in society. The rivalry between the two led to Du Bois's most influential work being published, The Souls of Black Folk. Manning Marble, the biographer of Du Bois, says, "Few books made history, and fewer still become foundational texts for the movements and struggles of an entire people. The Souls of Black Folk occupies this rare position. It helped to create the intellectual argument for the black freedom struggle in the 20th century. The Souls of Black Folk justified the pursuit of higher education for black people and thus contributed to the rise of the black middle class." In 1910, Du Bois and a group of other civil rights activists formed the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Du Bois began to publish The Crisis, a newspaper connected to the NAACP. The paper was used for promoting African American culture of the Harlem Renaissance and giving news related to the civil rights movement. The Crisis had an enormous impact on expanding public knowledge of Harlem Renaissance literature. Many of the most well-known works of the time by black Americans were originally published in The Crisis. Du Bois was ultimately unable to see the effects of his lifelong work. He did not live to see the advancement of the black community in the USA by any substantial margin. He died in 1961. His work, though, would go on to drive change for decades after his death. By setting the groundwork for the civil rights struggle, he ensured it would succeed, and without his tireless dedication, the movement would doubtless be set far back. Tonight we assemble here to pay tribute to one of the most remarkable men of our time. Dr. Du Bois was not only an intellectual giant exploring the frontiers of knowledge, he was in the first place a teacher. He would have wanted his life to teach us something about our tasks of emancipation. In conclusion, let me say that Dr. Du Bois's greatest virtue was his committed empathy with all the oppressed and his divine dissatisfaction with all forms of injustice. Today we are still challenged to be dissatisfied, Let us be dissatisfied until every man can have food and material necessities for his body, culture, and education, for his mind, freedom, and human dignity for his spirit. Let us be dissatisfied until the empty stomachs of the Mississippi are filled and the idle industries of Appalachia are revitalized. Let us be dissatisfied until brotherhood is no longer a meaningless word at the end of a prayer, but the first word of business on every legislative agenda. Let us be dissatisfied until this pending cosmic elegy will be transformed into a creative psalm of peace, and justice will roll down like waters from a mighty stream.